Jesus Christ took upon himself my sins, pains, and infirmities. This next section of Come Follow Me, Laura and I purposely pushed this to closer to the end of the week because this conversation we feel is so important to have in our homes as we prepare for the Easter holiday. So today we're going to be discussing three main questions. The three main questions that are brought up in this section is, what did Christ suffer? Why did Christ suffer? And what does this suffering mean to me today? And so three great questions, which we're all going to try our best to answer all three. And know that we will be incomplete in answering those, and so we'd love to hear from any of you, and we'd love for these conversations to continue in the home. But specifically, we're in three passages of scriptures: Mosiah chapter 3 verse 7, Mosiah chapter 15 5 through 9, and Alma 7 11 through 13. So not a lot of reading, but within these readings is a lot of information. So first, with Christ's suffering, Laura and I made a list. And so we just pulled right from the scriptures everything that is mentioned here. And then we'll talk about a few of them. So temptations, pain of the body, hunger, thirst, fatigue, blood came from every pore, mocked, scourged, cast out, disowned by his people, falsely led, crucified, slain, death, afflictions, sicknesses, infirmities, and sins. So what did Jesus Christ suffer? So much more than the sins of the world. The Book of Mormon does a great service to our understanding of the atonement by providing an enhanced look at just what Jesus Christ suffered.
Yeah, I love that because the Bible definitely teaches, that he suffered for our sins, but like it says in Come Follow Me, the Book of Mormon expands on that and kind of opens our minds and our hearts up to even more in that understanding.
So some of the things that kind of stood out to me, just kind of a couple of points here. One thing is that when we think of the atonement, we often think about the suffering, the death, and the resurrection. We think of the suffering in Gethsemane, the crucifixion and the death on the cross, and then the resurrection. I had it pointed out to me not long ago that's really expanded my understanding of the atonement. And as we read these, this kind of hinted at that too. The sufferings that he had of being mocked, being scourged, being cast out, being disowned by his people, those were all sufferings that occurred during his life, even back to his birth and in his youth years. And so I just want to kind of share this truth that I believe that his atonement is so much more than those events in those 3 days, those 5 day, that 5 day period or so, in which he suffered those things in Gethsemane, the cross, and the resurrection. It started with his birth. It went on through his life all the way up until even today. The atonement is still impacting our lives today. It's an infinite and eternal atonement that even started before his birth in the pre-existence.
I love that. And the one thing that stood out to me was with his suffering, specifically in Gethsemane. We read a while ago, the infinite atonement, and something that he taught just kind of blew my mind with the fact that Christ, I guess I always understood and I always thought because Christ was the God part of him, made his suffering bearable and made him able to, in my mind, kind of not suffer as much so that he was able to suffer for all. It doesn't really make sense now that I think about it, but for some reason I thought him being God made it so he could bear the suffering and it wasn't as hard. But Tad Cullister goes on and he explains that no, because he was God, he was able to suffer much more than we can even imagine. So where a man would suffer, and normally a man when he suffers so much, has so much pain, he passes out. Because Christ had that godness in him, he was half God. He had that in him. He went past that point. He didn't pass out, then he was able to suffer so much more deeply and so much more because of that. And so just that thought of the deepness, the depth, and the true overall suffering that he felt for all of us just really hit me and made me think about the atonement in a different way, or his suffering a different way than what I had originally thought.
And in these three passages, there was only three things that were mentioned in all of them. One was death, The other was temptations, and then the other was, like Laura mentioned, the pains. And so I'm going to go to that third question. What does this mean to me today? Because I love the idea, well, I don't love it, but I love the idea that temptations is so applicable for us today. One of the greatest sufferings mentioned in all three of these passages is temptation. The temptations that we feel is a form of suffering. It is a form of pain, especially when addiction comes into it and you have given into those temptations and you have established for yourself an addiction to that. It is very hard to break. And so I just think, I guess I just wanted to put a little thing out there that when we are faced with temptation, no, Jesus Christ truly understands that through the atonement. He knows what it's like to yearn to sin. He knows what it's like to want to give in to temptation.
Or being affected by somebody who has that temptation, you know? Yeah,
very great point. Very great point. Because temptations affect us in all different ways. The temptations of a loved one, the temptations of your children, the sins of others. And so I love that idea that word is mentioned in all three of those passages.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so the second question was
why?
Why did he suffer? So why did he suffer? There were a couple of things that stood out to me. The first one, first I'll talk about this one. Peter actually brought this up as we were reading the scriptures for it, and he asked this question that I'd never thought of before. He said, do you think Christ loved us more before he suffered or after he suffered? And I'm like, oh, well, I thought he always loved us. But I love the idea, like, when you get to know somebody more fully, you learn to love them more, right? Or at least understand them more. The more you get to know somebody, that, you know, the deeper the connection and everything. And with Christ, I feel like this probably helped him love us more completely. Because he suffered, he went to the deepest, darkest places of all of our souls. He suffered everything. He felt everything, suffered it all. Yeah. And because he knows us completely in that sense now, I feel like he could love completely as well. And so why did he suffer? This is not doctrinal. I don't know, but in my mind, he suffered so that he could love us completely, because he suffered completely for us.
It is doctrinal. It says here, being filled with compassion towards the children of men. It was through that suffering that he was filled with that compassion. And so I love that thought too. Another idea, he suffered to fulfill the demands of justice. With sin, there is a penalty. And in God's presence, only perfection can abide. And so we've got this idea where all men and all women are going to sin. So all men and all women are going to be held to those demands of justice, except it be with the atonement. And so Jesus Christ, through his merciful atonement, through his mercy, is able to fulfill the demands of justice. By coming unto Jesus Christ, he has borne the penalty so that we do not have to bear it. We can return to live with God. We can experience a God-like happiness because of the atonement of Jesus Christ. And what does the scripture say? Giving the Son power to make intercession for the children of men. Such a beautiful and eternal truth. Jesus Christ was redeemed to satisfy the demands of justice.
I love that. Sorry.
No, yeah, go.
Just really quick, with the worldwide fast going on, there was one thing in Mosiah 15:5 that said, thus the flesh becoming subject to the spirit. So part of his atonement was the flesh becoming subject to the spirit. And just to touch on this, in fasting, that's what we have a chance to do, is to help our flesh become subject to the spirit and strengthen our spirits. And we have all been invited to do a fast this weekend, specifically tomorrow. And so we have a chance to kind of follow Christ. You know, he says, come follow me. We have a chance to follow him in this aspect of it. And so he was able to do it fully and completely through the atonement, but we have a chance to do our part in kind of becoming a little bit more like Christ through this fast and subjecting our flesh to the spirit through fasting.
Christ, one of his purposes of suffering was to one of his purposes of suffering was to succor us unto him, so that we will be turned towards him. We will come unto him. We will follow him. And so I love that. I think Laura's kind of answered that third question. And so now we'll just pose that question to you of what does the atonement of Jesus Christ mean to you today?